right, good day. Dambash everyone. Chawanin. Navimen Shahrina as Wegtakaldara Darbaye, the Instituya Zahra Kurdistan. And that's it for my intermediate level Kumanji Kurdish. I am Sharina Sharani, Outreach Coordinator at Zahra Institute. Today's presentation is the Institute's second talk for the Spring Speaker Series. I will be introducing you to our guests and help facilitate conversation here for the Q&A part after the presentation. So please type any questions that you might have on the presentation in the chat box. We will get to as many of them as we can after the presentation. And for those who are interested, a video recording of this presentation should be made available on Zahra Institute's Facebook page within a few days. Again, welcome, marhaba everyone. Today, we will learn about the history of Jews in Iraqi Kurdistan in the 20th century with Michael Brill. A little background on Michael. So Michael and I, we met while studying at the Center for Arabic Study Abroad program in Amman, Jordan. It's also known as the CASA program, during what I refer to as the snowpocalypse of 2013. These days, Michael Brill is a PhD candidate in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. His research focuses on modern Iraq. For the current academic year, he is a fellow at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. He's also a fellow at the Princeton Center for Culture, Society, and Religion. Michael will soon be finishing his dissertation on the political life and afterlife of Mashal Aflaq in Iraq. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Michael Brill. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shahrina, for an overly generous introduction. And thank you to Ibrahim, Mujahid, and everyone affiliated with you, Shahrina, at the Zahra Institute. It's been wonderful to learn about Zahra. Going back over the last few months, the programs you have, the activities you're sponsoring, and an even bigger honor to be part of that with my talk today. I'm very, very grateful to everyone who made the time on a sure busy Wednesday with difficult time zone adjustments to be here. Last, but I'm not definitely not least, I would be remiss to say that Shahrina, going back a decade now, your support providing shelter and food during that snowpocalypse in Amman, and mentorship throughout as you finished your dissertation, the year since then has been great. And I think back to conversations we had at that time a decade ago and how different the landscape is. I know then it was one wanted to study Sorani or Kermanji. Perhaps the best hope was having a graduate student in the department somewhere in the country who could offer classes on an ad hoc basis. So I know Zahra and the work all of you have been doing is at the forefront of changing this dynamic very dramatically in a short period of time. With that said, though, I'll turn to my presentation, and I'll look forward to discussion and Q&A afterwards. And pull up my PowerPoint. Okay. Slideshow. Okay. As was already mentioned, title of my talk is The History of Jews in Iraqi Kurdistan During the 20th Century. I'd like to start with mentioning that my talk will draw on a recent publication along with two other works that are in progress. One I need to actually submit by the end of the month, a chapter and edited volume, and the other is a draft article in progress with my advisor from Georgetown University, Joseph Sassoon. Chapter published an edited volume pictured on this slide last year was an overview history of Iraq's Jewish community during the 20th century to the present day, some of which I'll draw in my talk today, but I'll also include a lot of material from these other two works as well. To begin, providing an overview of Jews in the territory of the modern state of Iraq. This history is traced back nearly 2,600 years, dating to the Babylonian exile and captivity. From that time through the beginning of the Common Era, the lands of Iraq were at the center of Jewish civilization. It was a place where the Talmud was produced. Then with the advent of Islam, from the Abbasid to the Ottoman empires, Jews in the provinces of Iraq were somewhere at the center of Islamic civilization. With the end of the Ottoman Empire, British occupation at the end of World War I, to the creation of the modern state of Iraq, the Kingdom of Iraq. Jews by this period representing between a quarter to a third of the population of the city of Baghdad were central to commerce, along with the cultural and social spheres. However, after the Second World War, the first Arab-Israeli War, along with rising tensions and persecution of Iraq's Jewish population in retaliation for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. This culminated in a series of repressive measures aimed at confiscating Jewish assets and leading ultimately to the citizenship law, revoking nationality for ultimately the majority of Iraq's Jewish population. Between 1949 1951, about 130,000 migrated from Iraq to Israel. Many stayed there, but many also went elsewhere to Europe and the United States, where the Iraqi Jewish diaspora continues to be today. Also at this time, so I'll turn to in greater detail later, the population of Jews in northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan migrated en masse, first from northern Iraq to central Iraq, primarily Baghdad, and also departed and are counted among the 130,000 who left. By the late 50s, only about 5,000 Jews remained. By and large, these were wealthy or well-connected, urbanite, primarily in Baghdad, people who had the resources or business assets that were too complicated to quickly unwind. I quote in my slide here, Ba'ath Party statistics from decades later, putting that figure at exactly 4,906 Jews spread across 1,336 families. During the 1960s and 1970s, especially surrounding the 1967-1973 Arab-Israeli wars, there were waves of persecution. This increased dramatically after the Ba'ath Party came to and consolidated power in 1968 in Iraq. In 1969, there were show trials and hangings of Jews and others accused of being Zionist spies. It was kind of a complicated dynamic, but between this period and the early 70s, the Ba'ath regime alternated between encouraging and allowing, but restricting Jewish migration from the country. However, after this period, only about 500 were still in Iraq. By 1975, and recognizing this, the Ba'ath regime moderated its position towards Iraq's remaining Jews and actually tried to use it as a propaganda issue that time. They took out English newspaper ads, including papers like the New York Times and elsewhere, advertising that they were encouraging Iraq's Jewish population, specifically patriotic, non-Zionist Jews, to return to Iraq and reclaim foreign property assets. However, unsurprisingly, only a handful actually took up this offer. By the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, there was greater Western news media access to Iraq, and the status of Iraq's remaining Jews was of some recurring interest at this time. There's a writer for the New Yorker who visited, a number of other journalists who commented on them as well. By this point, uh, Iraq's remaining Jews were largely left alone. And if anything, the remaining synagogue was somewhere where Western reporters were directed to see that they were tolerated and allowed to live out their lives. There was another wave of migration after the 1990-91 Gulf War. By 2001, there were only 39 Jews remaining, and as of this presentation today, only 3 remain. That's a synopsis of Iraq, broadly speaking. Now I'll turn to the background for northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan with respect to Jewish history as well. I think it's important to state that, like other population groups within the most diverse region in northern Iraq, the Jewish population was not anyway monolithic or homogeneous, and even more importantly, did not live in isolation from its neighbors. In this respect, culturally and linguistically, they reflected the environment in which they lived in, and more specifically, the Jewish community of Mosul was heavily Arabized, and Kirkuk and Sulaymaniyah, heavily Turkified, and in Kanakin, Zakho, Dohuk, and Erbil, there were bilingual Kurdish Aramaic communities. Kurdish Jews were socially and culturally very different and distinct from the culturally Arabized Jews of central and southern Iraq. This also came down along socioeconomic lines as well. As scholars of Iraqi Jewry, like Orit Bashkin, I know you're all well familiar with it. Zahra in Chicago has written about that Jews from Kurdistan were often worked in the homes of wealthier Jews in places like Baghdad as servants, and this was something that was facilitated by rural to urban migration process that played out in Iraq and much of the world during the 20th century. Again, in rural settings in northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived in the same areas and villages. Jews were reliant on Kurdish agas for protection, and intermarriage, specifically the marriage of Jewish women to Muslim Kurds was quite common. However, there's little in the way of written sources about the history of Iraq's Jews and Jews in Iraqi Kurdistan prior to the 19th century. Methodologically, something that is a challenge to many other aspects of history of the region, of course, as well, at least with respect to official archival sources. Curiously, Jews from the region, alongside Yemenite Jews, were actually among some of the first to migrate to Palestine during the 1920s. As I previously mentioned, the community more or less in its entirety left northern Iraq during the mass exodus of Iraq's Jews in 1950, 1951. According to the BAF's figures, by 1952, no Jews remained in Erbil. There were 12 in Mosul, 5 in Kirkuk, and 6 in Sulaymaniyah. Later figures from 1987, reflecting migration from central to northern Iraq and other developments, placed this figure at 16 total, 3 in Dohuk, 5 in Erbil, and only 8 in Sulaymaniyah. I turn now to a specific archival collection, which is the source of those statistics which I've cited, but also stands at the center of my previous publication I mentioned, and also the two that are in progress. This is a collection, or digitized collection, I should emphasize, of documents called the Jewish Presence in Iraq data set. This is included among the other digital collections of the Iraq Memory Foundation that are at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. Since this is a digital collection, along with the other Iraqi Ba'ath regime collections, these are actually available both at their primary Palo Alto, Stanford location in California, and also at the Washington, D.C. office. The origins of this collection is quite interesting. That a Jewish um, um, businessman and advocate Edwin Shuker, post 2003, actually bought it from a former Iraqi Mukhabarat officer who was selling it on the black market for documents, which there was a there was a real market for in the years immediately after the invasion. I Hoover doesn't allow the taking of pictures of documents, but I wrote out a copy in my very bad handwriting of the agreement that Shuker signed with this former Mukhabarat officer for the two boxes. They're about 280 pages of documents. In exchange for 5,000 US, he promised that didn't make copies of the documents, and that wasn't going to try to sell such copies elsewhere. The provenance of this is somewhat similar to the much larger Iraqi Jewish archive, which included a much larger trove of historic communal Jewish documents that post 2003 was discovered based on a tip from a former Mukhabarat officer. I raised the question about a connection, and that it does seem that with the U.S. invasion and occupation, there was an awareness among the security services that records related to Jews would be of interest to Iraq's new authorities with the occupation. In short, the collection gives a kind of time capsule snapshot of Iraq's 39 remaining Jews, along with people identified as being of Jewish origin or converting to Islam or Christianity, along with their descendants. People labeled as of Jewish origin or conversion from Judaism were documented as 81 in Iraq proper, and along with 140 in the areas of northern Iraq, which had been beyond the Ba'ath regime's control after the 1991 war, no-fly zone. Interestingly, as much detail as this collection provides on the 39 remaining in Iraq, 36 of which lived in Baghdad, it's clear that the main trigger was actually what was going on up in Kurdistan during this period, the region that the Ba'ath still referred to euphemistically as the autonomous region. And they had heard reports or received reports that people of either Jewish origin or those who had converted were actually apostatizing and returning back to their original Judaism. And as such, were traveling between northern Iraq and Israel. And you also had the movement of Jews who had migrated from the region decades prior, who were returning to northern Iraq to visit distant family and also ancestral villages and family friends there. The fear from the Ba'ath regime was that this was a very useful cover for Mossad operations, and also aware that the CIA and the Iraqi opposition was operating in the region at this time as well. So it triggered a full out study by the regime to figure out what was going on. Before turning to that study and what it found, I wanted to mention a little bit more on the way of archival sources for the history of northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan proper, some of which have some bearing on this talk, include relevant documents, um, a major collection, which I actually wrote an article about with Joseph Sassoon about 4 years ago now, was the North Iraq data set. This was captured by Kurdish civilians and turned political parties um, after the uprising that followed um, the 1990-91 Gulf War. This archive was later airlifted out of Iraq, ended up at the University of Colorado Boulder, where it remained until 2005. In short, the Hoover Institution has a copy of this. Boulder did, and the major Kurdish parties were, and also I believe the Zine Center was given a copy of it as well. This collection in particular was used by Human Rights Watch to produce a number of studies documenting the Anfal campaign and genocide of the 1980s. It remains a important collection for scholars. The Bath Regional Command Collection, which is the primary digital collection that Hoover has, which was taken from party headquarters in 2003, contains documents that correspond with both the North Iraq data set, but also this Jewish presence in Iraq subset collection I mentioned as well. Additionally, there's a place called the Conflict Records Research Center that, for a short period of time, was in Washington, D.C. before closing due to funding issues. It contained a number of document and also audio records related to history of Kurdistan, broadly speaking, but also the Anfal campaigns, the Iran-Iraq War, affecting the region. That I think, if not specifically related to the Jewish history of the region, was still of real value. Next week, with the launch of a new book by award-winning journalist Steve Cole, the digital archive of the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. is actually going to start re-releasing many of the documents and audio tapes that were included in this collection in DC between 2010 and 2015. Again, not related to this topic specifically, but I do think there will be records included among that related to the Anfal campaign, Ba'athist rule in northern Iraq, and other topics that will be of interest to the Zahra Institute. Returning back to the 2001 study conducted by the Ba'ath regime, documenting Iraq's remaining Jews, but also people identified of Jewish origin. The result of this is actually a valuable window into a somewhat small and obscure, but to my knowledge, forgotten episode from the 1990s that points to historic contacts between Israel in the region, but also more specifically the role of the Kurdistan Democratic Party in this. This was something that actually dated back to the 1960s, given Iraq's participation in the coalitions against Israel in the Arab-Israeli wars, called the Israel's Doctrine of the Periphery, where basically they supported states and non-state actors who were opposed to the states that were arrayed against Israel in those conflicts. This took the form of support for the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Mustafa Barzani, shape of training, military weapons, and also medical treatment for Barzani personally. However, this also inadvertently provided a very helpful conduit for the escape of Iraq's remaining Jews fleeing persecution during this period as well. During the early 1970s, and then the lull in fighting between the Kurds and Baghdad, some 3,000 Jews were actually able to escape Iraq through Kurdistan with the help of the KDP and Mossad, which was able to operate there. These ties were further facilitated by the presence of a fairly substantial and also growing community of Kurdistan's Jews that had migrated to Israel and continued to reside there. Following the Anfal campaigns, Israel even settled 225 Kurdish families in 1989. And given awareness to Kurdish suffering and the aftermath of the Gulf War, as Saddam's regime sought to put down the uprising in northern Iraq, there were calls on the street level, but also within the Israeli political sphere to support the Kurds in their time of need then as well. As I had mentioned, by the 1990s, when the implementation of the no-fly zone and de facto Kurdish autonomy, this provided a window by visits from Jews in Israel to ancestral homes and distant family, and also for people to migrate from the region to Israel and elsewhere. A major driver of this was the civil war that broke out between the KDP and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. The worst years of most intense fighting between the years of 1994 and 1997. And during this time, the Jewish Agency and the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan, Israel, sponsored the migration of an estimated 1,100 individuals from northern Iraq. However, only about 100 remained in Israel, and it was the travel back and forth and people coming and going that had triggered this study by the Iraqi security services, and it was something they had picked up on, had not gone according to plan. I jumped from the 1990s in the early 2000s up to 2015, moving towards the conclusion. The Kurdistan regional government appointed an individual named Shirzad Omar Mahmoud as the Jewish representative to the Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs. After lobbying on Mahmoud's part, he claimed to speak for some 730 families of hidden Jews who had either converted nominally and maintained their faith in hiding, or claimed Jewish heritage. He enlisted a rabbi in Haifa and even a kind of a strange group of evangelical Christian missionaries who had been run out of most countries they had been in previously. In short, this ploy was successful for some time until he and his co-conspirators were outed by Israel's leading scholar, himself a descendant of Jews from Iraqi Kurdistan, Mordecai Zakan, and the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan in Israel, which confirmed that he was an imposter and that the supposed 730 families he claimed to be representing did not, in fact, exist. Some conclusions from all this: the difficulties with the Aliyah, as it's called, the homecoming operation of the 1990s from northern Iraq, informed the actions of the Jewish Agency, Israel, and other groups in Iraq in the wake of the 2003 war. There wasn't nearly as much of a dedicated effort to search out, find, and encourage the migration of remaining Jews. They did contact um, those remaining within central Iraq and let them know, although there was very deliberately not an effort to look for people of Jewish heritage or who had converted previously. My theory on this is it was a combination of embarrassment from this previous episode, but also being overshadowed by the arrival of a much larger Jewish population from the former Soviet Union, but also Ethiopia that contributed to the relegation of this comparably small episode. The Bath records on the subject raise a number of very interesting historiographical issues, which, to my knowledge, haven't really been touched on. One of these is actually the matter of conversions that took place. So there was never a official policy of trying to force conversion or encourage conversion under the Ba'ath or any of its predecessor regimes. The records do indicate that many people, given the choice or perhaps lacking the means to do so, did choose to convert in order to remain in Iraq. The records also point to the enduring reach of the Ba'ath Party into northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan after 1991, specifically the areas that were outside the regime's control. This was done by a combination means, which include long-standing informant networks, but also maintaining ties with religious and tribal leaders, which continued to be a source of information pushing up to the eve of the 2003 U.S.-led invasion. Imposters notwithstanding, the evidence does suggest that it's likely that isolated Jews remained in the areas of northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan for at least decades after most had left the region. And last but definitely not least, the issue of imposters and false claims, both in northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan today, but also within Baghdad, does have some pretty serious implications. I should have mentioned in the previous slide that the chief among the motivations for this are people trying to make claims for considerable property and confiscated assets that the Iraqi state has either accumulated over the decades or has been largely dormant with the exodus of Iraq's Jewish community over the decade. So this is something that, given what happened, is undoubtedly very much on the radar now of authorities and the Kurdistan regional government, but also should be continue to be going forward there and Baghdad proper. But, with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you very much again for attending, listening. I look forward to questions, comments, and discussion.
Thanks, Michael, for this great presentation. And right now, I'm going to invite the audience here to type in any questions you might have on the presentation in the chat box. In the meantime, I will kickstart the Q&A portion of this event with a few questions here. So Michael, among our audience are students and instructors from our research methods and academic conventions for the MA program in Kurdish Studies. So I want to start out with questions about your archival research. So how were you able to access these documents from the Ba'ath Security Services? And if you could also describe to us more about your archival research process, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question, Shafreen. I accessed these documents at both the locations of the Hoover Institution Library and Archives, both in California, but also the Digital Collections Satellite Office in Washington, DC. The collections are, fortunately, I guess in this case, specifically the subset of 280 documents, that they're not keyword searchable. So it really was just a matter of scrolling through and reading each page within it. Fortunately, the scans were high resolution. I spent enough time there that I actually, they don't let you take pictures, but I typed or hand wrote copies of it, as you saw a sample of from my very bad Arabic handwriting. I similarly with other corresponding documents, let's say like the North Iraq data set and also the Bath Regional Command collection that are included within those digital Hoover collections. I did a similar thing. I actually have the notebook. I wrote all this in right here, so that's a little window into the process.
All right, so going to the chat box here, there's Rawan Zagros wrote, Palestinian people and leaders openly hate Kurds and Kurdistan, which is why they expressed themselves at the independence election in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2017. They even supported Saddam and endorsed his Anfal genocide by Yasser Arafat. The question is, why do the Kurds have more sympathy towards Arab Israelis or Palestinians than historical friends and brothers of Jewish people? Even though we were killed, exiled, and genocide by our tyrannical so-called Muslim neighbors. That's by Rowan Zagros.
Thank you for your question, Roland. Thanks for reading, Shafri. I just want to read through it
Sure.
myself to make sure I understood the question correctly. Yeah, as you said, it's a difficult position. I remember being struck by the fact that Israel's rapid recognition, support of the referendum, and some of the reactions or treatment to it surprised, but it's very much, I think, in keeping of those long-standing ties between the parties. It's certainly true, like Yasser Arafat was a regular guest of Saddam, even though Saddam didn't personally like him. Arafat and the PLO went all in with the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, and the PLO received, and other groups, the Popular Front Liberation of Palestine, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, all received support from Baghdad. I hesitate to go too far beyond the historical documents. I don't know. I would be I hesitate to try speaking for Kurds as a group or to generalize. I'd say that at least as much as one can, my sense of this is that the experience of Kurds in Iraq or Syria or Turkey or in Iraq under successive governments going back to the British Mandate, the monarchy, kind of beginnings of Kurdish rebellion, all the way up through the Ba'ath, have that sympathy because they're very much aware of the being on the receiving end of violent repression from the state, and especially as non Arab community in the region as well. That's I'll leave it at that. I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, I'm reading those in chat here aloud. Just I know some people are calling in and might not be able to access this. So the next one is by Bashur. There were two Jewish sisters named, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can pronounce that, Musha and Mari Musha, who later went by the names Nazdat Farhad and Asmar Farhad, went to Baghdad to sing for radio stations. What are some other contributions Jews made to Kurdish language, culture, or art?
That's a really interesting. I was unaware of them, so that's very interesting to learn about. No, I'm not a. I don't claim to be a cultural um, historian. I think undoubtedly historically, like contributions date back even time period where sources aren't readily available. And in the more modern period, I admit this is something I'll have to do more reading about. Do believe there's a couple chapters where um, Orit Bashkin mentions a number of Kurdish um, Jews who contributed to the cultural and social spheres of Jewish life in Iraq. I do know it's a difficult one in that um, the literacy rates even up through the early mid 20th century among the population, Jewish population in northern Iraq was much less um, than that in central Iraq. So the issue of sources and this makes it additionally difficult. But thank you for that very interesting information, but also your question. I'll have to do some more reading about.
And then the next one is by Kani. You know, the migration of 2,000 Jews to Palestine in 1920s. Who are they? Did they have relations with the Zionists in Europe? Where did they go in Palestine? And can you expand on their fate?
Yeah, this is something that like comes through. Like I'm having I guess the Iraqi the Ba'ath records include a history um, of the Jews of Kurdistan. They mention this as well. This is something that is in the secondary scholarship. I think I cite Mordecai Zakin's book on this. A lot of this is hard to pinpoint exactly, but my understanding from the scholarship is that there appear to have actually been contacts um, between Jews in Kurdistan, and along with the region of Palestine, going back to the medieval period as well, and that this is attributed less to the outreach specifically of Zionist activists in Iraq at this time, which would be in keeping with I guess the limited appeal this even had within Iraq, central Iraq, until after the first Arab-Israeli war. So it's a very good question. Something I apologize. I don't know much about beyond what's out there in the secondary literature on this, but it's a very interesting subject.
The next one is by Dorotha. Uh, and she said, thank you. Question, are there any details in the archives you accessed concerning the remote Jews who stayed in Iraq and remained Jewish?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Dora. There actually is. There's a lot of information about them. Um, let's say that even though they weren't the trigger for that 2001 study, and the process of putting it together, the party and the security services, pretty much in every province, sent reports on those who remained Jews or were of Jewish origin um, back to party command, where it was tabulated. Most of which, I think, 36 of the 39, as I mentioned, remained in Baghdad. And what they put together, they were heavily a servile community, despite being only 39 individuals. By this point, they tabulated their age, their addresses, their professions, what they had done, family connections. So yeah, there actually is as a result of this, a lot of rich material that relates to those who stayed Jewish.
Dorotha wrote, there are some words from Aramaic and Kurdish. I I think Kurbana and Shada, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. So there you go. That's just a comment there. And then Connie wrote, Michael, 280 pages for $5,000. That is $17 per page. What was on those pages? Was it worth it?
Yeah, I guess that's a question for Edwin Shooker, who paid that. I would say though that given the black market for former regime documents, that I imagine it was for Shooker, returning Iraqi Jewish diaspora community, but also from an archival standpoint, it really is kind of a unique window into those who remain, but also the history of this community. I think goes beyond much of what was available and commonly known.
Sadar had the question, how did British colonial influences shape the historiography of Iraqi Jews? And what are some key aspects of the history that have emerged through these colonial lenses?
That's a good question. The degree that British colonial shaped the historiography, well, I guess on the one hand, like it was how to word that? How to shape it? I guess on the one hand, that right from the beginning, there was a concerted effort from the Jewish community and its leadership to ask for British um, citizenship right from the beginning of the mandate. In terms of the commercial role of Iraq's Jews, there was immediate as business ties to the arrangement that the British inherited from the Ottomans, which then later undoubtedly shaped the networks, institutions, but also people as Jews fled Iraq and went to Israel or onward to places like England and beyond. I'd say though that at least from an immediate historiographical sense, that it didn't shape the historiography wasn't shaped in a way that's necessarily beneficial to the British or in any propagandistic sense. If anything, you had people like Eli Kaduri, um, self the Iraqi Jew, who was no fan of um, Arab nationalism, British colonialism, imperialism in the region, and um, held them responsible along with the leading, as you could say, Orientalist scholars of his time for contributing to the demise of a pluralistic Iraqi society. So I would say at least in terms of the degree that there's still a fairly limited English language historical scholarship on Iraqi Jews. I think that the main contours of which are very much kind of fall within this line thought that emphasized yes, the Iraqness of the community, but also its pluralism and diversity. Thinking most notably of scholars like Chicago's Orit Bashkin and her students who work on earlier periods of Jewish history in Iraq.
The next one is by Bruce, and Bruce is one of our instructors here teaching Kurmanji through my class. And he wrote, thanks for the nice presentation, Zor Spas. How do you find the relationship between Jewish Kurds and Israel and Kurdistan, all parts, especially the young generation who are born in Israel?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I just to turn more to what I've encountered um, in the historical documents on this, it does seem to be something that I wouldn't say drove Israeli policy but it's something that definitely facilitated that. And even when it came to matters of language training or military training, and I guess in short, I think um, these population groups and cultural connections be what they were. I think policy that Israel pursued in the region vis-a-vis um, the Arab states, but also its alliances with various state and non-state actors were going to happen anyways. Although this definitely these connections gave it a extra benefit with the with the policy vis-a-vis Iraq and the threat Israel perceived from Saddam Hussein's regime. I think working with the Kurds on various levels is something that my understanding has happened again with Syria's Kurds to varying degrees since the uprising in Syria in 2011. Degree, I'm not really qualified to speak on the younger generation in Israel, although it certainly seems that we're just from reading the headlines on this that descendants of this community in Israel continue to play a prominent role in the political sphere today.
I think any other questions here? Mujahid, do you have any
Yeah,
questions?
maybe a quick clarification regarding an earlier question by Rawan Zagros. Claim that Palestinian people and leaders hate Kurds. This is not a factual thing, as part of freedom of speech, we are entitled to say what we think, but this is a scholarly gathering, and, we don't approve such claims, but the person is entitled to it. So I want to make that clarification and express our gratefulness to Michael for this very interesting presentation. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mujahid. And I hope I did. I probably should have more explicitly stated as much. I did try to address that question and turn it substantively without acknowledging the kind of a essentialist claim about Palestinian people. So thank you for that. And
yeah, especially when Palestinians are dying en masse, being killed en masse.
yeah,
that's really not fair to. So
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Any other questions here right now? I think I believe I read everything that's on the chat box. All right, so then, okay, that concludes, I think, the Q&A section and our second event. So please mark your calendar for the third event of our speaker series, which will take place on March 20th. Our next speaker, Sasha, and Sasha's may still be in our audience, from the University of Munster, will present on the Sharafnama as a case study in the eco-linguistics of Kurdistan. Thank you, Spas, everyone, for your support and attendance. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.